Welcome to Marney Reid Presents Connect to Develop, where we provide insight from healthcare leaders on the hottest topics and trends.
Hello, listeners. This is the second in our two-part series discussing the nuances of entering into a professional service agreement, also known as PSA, or employment with the health system. In today's episode, we'll discuss legal considerations to address if you or your group decide to exit a PSA with the health system, the exit strategy and cadence to follow if you decide to move forward with the divorce, so to speak, ways you can maintain a good relationship if possible with the health system if you part ways and remain in the area, and how to navigate your non-compete and other post-termination restrictions. I'd like to introduce you to Dana Jacoby, CEO and founder of Vector Medical Group, who brings insight and experience from over 2 decades working in healthcare. She spent the last 10 plus years assisting physician groups and departments with market strategy that encompasses helping them navigate the nuances of both entering and exiting health system employment and PSAs. Hi, Dana.
Hi, Marney. Thanks for having me for this important conversation.
And Gary Herschman, Esquire, member of the law firm Epstein Becker Green. Gary brings over 30 years of experience negotiating contracts and terms between physicians and health systems. Hey, Gary.
Hey, Marney. Thanks for having me on this important discussion.
Gary, as with any parting of ways, we all hope things will be amicable as it applies to a divorce from a health system, whether it's full-scale employment or from a PSA. What are some of the most critical contract terms a physician or group needs to understand when leaving?
Well, the most important things you need to think about, you need to look at your contract very carefully, preferably have an experienced attorney look at your contract, are how do you get out? What kind of notice must you provide in order to resign from the agreement or terminate the agreement, resign from employment, or terminate a PSA? Some agreements have a 90-day termination clause, advance notice. Some have 6 months. Some have 1 year. Some even say that you can't provide a notice to terminate without cause in the first 5 years. So every contract is different, and you need to look at your ability to get out and on what notice. The second thing you need to look at is your non-compete. What restrictions are there going to be on the effective date of your termination from your PSA or employment? And so some non-competes are very broad and say 10 miles or 20 miles from the locations you worked at. Other non-competes, especially in PSAs, might be more limited, might only apply to you working for one of the competing hospitals in the region. Back 5 to 10 years ago, a lot of PSAs that were entered into had non-competes that were limited to competing with this hospital by working on behalf of one of its competitor hospitals. So you need to look at that very carefully. And also important, you need to have a plan in place. How are you going to start practicing once you're officially terminated from your employment or your PSA? Things you need to think about are how am I going to have an office? How am I going to have staff? If you do a lot of work with commercial insured patients, how am I going to get payer contracts? A lot of these things take a lot of time. Getting a Medicare number for a new group entity is relatively easy, but getting credentialed and getting contracts with managed care and various commercial payers is very timely. And also, you need to think about nowadays, almost every group has an electronic medical record system. How are you going to arrange for that? So there's different ways to think about these things. Sometimes you could, on an EMR in particular, you could try to have a friendly divorce with the hospital and continue on their EMR. And they may like that because then you continue to be aligned with them. Or you could look at an existing group in the community or a private equity platform that's active in your area. And either one of those would be more than happy to try to set you up and make that investment to set you up in private practice, assuming it complies with your non-compete.
What about, to what you just alluded to, a physician leaving employment or joining, a PE-backed group or another strategic or in that area? Any other legal considerations that you've seen come back to bite the physician that they just didn't realize they were stepping into? Staffing, referral sources, current patients, let's say that they are in a profession where they have to do follow-ups and everything, and maybe they were employed beforehand or whatnot, are they still able to see that patient, or does that patient belong to the health system?
Well, in addition to non-competes, these agreements also contain what's called a non-solicitation clause, which has two parts to it. You can't solicit employees of the hospital, the group within the hospital that you worked with, but you also can't solicit patients. So the way we get around not soliciting patients is that patients will seek you out and find where you are. If they call your prior office at the hospital, most are going to be okay saying no longer with us, but here's his or her phone number or address. But the truth is, in this day and age, what would you do? You just Google the doctor. The doctor's probably going to have a new
Exactly.
website. And so I don't think the patients are as much of an issue. It used to be maybe 20 years ago, patient lists and all that were more important, but now your existing patients can easily find you.
That makes sense. Is it easier or harder if just one physician decides to leave a PSA or employment, or a small group of them, or the entire group? Or does it really matter because it really just comes down to the clauses in the contract?
Yeah, and I hate saying this, it's a typical lawyer answer, but it depends. What I've seen is that a lot of hospitals nowadays have a very negative knee-jerk reaction to private equity. They don't like it. They don't like their doctors in their community or who are employed by them moving to private equity platforms. And it's hard to explain why. I guess it's because it's outside of the hospital's control. But groups who are independent now are outside the hospital's control. I just think that the hospital is probably concerned that they're going to have more capital and more ability to grow, both in size of providers and office locations and ancillary services. And the hospitals feel threatened. That being said, when you look at a distinction between 6 orthopedic surgeons, hypothetically, leaving employment at a hospital versus one, on the one hand, the hospital may say, oh, it's just one person leaving, we don't care. But by the same token, they're going to want to set an example. They're not going to want everyone to just then, like run on the bank where everybody just leaves. So they're going to enforce the non-compete. They're not going to, because if all of a sudden they give leeway to one doctor, that kind of sets a precedent that if you're not enforcing your non-competes with one doctor, you shouldn't be able to with others. So I think with one doctor, even though it's just one doctor, where you might think they might not care as much, they're going to try to enforce the non-compete. If they go outside the non-compete radius, there's nothing the hospital can do. An entire group, like let's say it's the 6 joint replacement surgeons, and maybe it's all of them or it's a majority of them who are employed at a hospital physician enterprise. In that case, I think there's the potential that group brings with it some leverage. The hospital still needs them to be affiliated with the hospital and close with the hospital. And the hospital may work out some arrangement and might be willing to be flexible on them maybe going back into the community and maybe even waive the non-compete radius if they commit to continue to actively participate in the hospital through medical directorships, on-call coverage, other administrative duties, consistent with what they're doing now as, employees of the hospital, but to continue with that because the hospital doesn't want their joint replacement program to all of a sudden, go from, doing really, really well to having very few, if any, surgeons continuing. So I do think it's a matter of leverage, and those things can be negotiated.
Leverage is always key. Dana, from a strategy standpoint, what does the exit cadence look like from when a surgeon or a group goes from saying, okay, we think we need to do this, to when they actually can break ties?
Yeah, it was interesting, Marnie. I was listening to Gary's response. I think his word friendly divorce summarizes kind of, the thought process behind this. We have had everything from literally the doctors are not telling the hospital until they are, on the finish line as far as an exit, and that there's that scenario. And we've had everything. Literally, I have a situation right now where the doctors have such a great relationship with their hospital the hospital was told from day one they were considering this, and then everything in between. So, it really depends on the relationship between the two out of the gate. Most hospitals, if you sit down with them, first day and say, hey, we're thinking about leaving, think about any marriage, right? It doesn't go so well. So it's very thoughtful. We usually start talking about this. A lot of doctors don't even know, Marnie, this is an option. In other words, they think they're married and they're unhappily married and there's no opportunity for them to vote with their feet. And there are opportunities for them to vote with their feet. I also had a client earlier this year that actually looked to vote with their feet. And then as they looked at other opportunities, they doubled down on their hospital relationship and actually went back and negotiated better terms, but they knew what their worth was to the outside market. So a very long-winded answer to your short question, but it depends. This is a very thoughtful process. I think early on, we want doctors to get somebody like Gary involved that can look at their situation and see, is an exit even an option? We want to look at what their opportunity is to stand up a practice outside of the hospital. We do this all the time at Vector, where we'll actually build a pro forma as if they were independent and show them what that would look like if they were to leave. What are the costs associated with it? What kind of capital partner might they need? There's a lot that goes into this versus just, I'm going to go build a house. You've got to be very thoughtful. Can you build a house? Are there things that, let's say you have a non-compete, do you have to build your house at 31 miles instead of 30 miles from the hospital because of things that are in that contract arrangement? So it really depends how long. We would love to have, 2 years, 1 year. If their PSA is coming up or their employment situation is coming up for renewal, we'd love to have enough time to really look at the terms, look at what the financial opportunity could be, and then build out a structure legally, financially, and operationally that talks about all the things Gary mentioned. So, the earlier we can have those conversations, the better. And then you start to put the strategy in place of based on their relationship with the hospital, when the opportune time would be to actually tell them what you're considering.
There is a great quote in, I believe it was the first or maybe second Matrix, where Neo goes to visit the Oracle and the bodyguard, out of nowhere just starts fighting him and then pauses partway in, and Neo looks at him like, what's going on? And he says, you don't truly know someone until you fight them. And so I think to the point that you made, you may think you've got a great relationship, but when someone tells you they're leaving you, you really see the side of who they are.
I totally agree, Marnie. And like any relationship, don't threaten that. In other words, if you're considering it, don't threaten it until you're really ready to exercise it. So it's not a negotiation strategy to say, I might leave you. In any relationship, that starts to put everybody on notice, and it basically makes that, that relationship becomes a very tense relationship. If you're seriously considering this, you need to know, one, can you do it? Two, how would you do it? And once you have that kind of strength behind you as far as the education, then only then you can go in and start to really appropriately have these conversations. But sometimes that relationship is such that you really can't say anything until you're so out that you are ready to throw the gauntlet down and move. We prefer to not have it that way, but unfortunately, sometimes that has been the relationship that's been built.
And from a legal perspective, Marnie, if I could just add, I always advise the doctors in that situation to not talk to the hospital, because these are doctors, assuming these are doctors that are unhappy with the hospital, my recommendation to them is they could always be terminated too. So you don't want to start having this tough discussion and then having the hospital, because the hospital may not think there's anything wrong and may not think that there's risk. And if they did think there's risk, they could terminate doctors, and then the doctors are stuck without a carefully developed plan. So I always like them to have their plan. I think nowadays it's hard to kind of go out into private practice, get your own payer agreements. It's extremely difficult without a capital partner or joining an existing platform or group. So I think you cut that deal and then you very carefully orchestrate in a diplomatic way, how you're going to provide your notice to leave and how you're going to continue to be big supporters and be closely aligned with the hospital. I always think that's the best way to do it, but some people like to have the conversation And when you have the conversation, you lose control.
Agree.
What is the most common non-compete that you see physicians dealing with these days if when exiting a health system?
And most of the times it's anywhere from 10 to 20 miles, and it's 1 to 2 years. That's generally what I see. And I said before, I guess what Dana said is if it's 20 miles, go 20.1 miles out and start a practice. Your patients will maybe drive a little further to see you. And then when the year or 2 years is up, open a second office right back across the street from the hospital where you were. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it would be to negotiate with the hospital to say, again, I mentioned this before, but to say, hey, I want to have a good relationship with you. I'm not happy with you, but I do a lot of work with the hospital. I think the hospital is a great place. I want to continue to be fully aligned with the hospital and work out some type of arrangement where they'll let you go. Maybe they'll let you go 10 miles away if the radius is 20 miles or 5 miles away if it's 10 miles, and some type of negotiated arrangement where then you would continue to be aligned with the hospital through directorships and, their SIN or IPA or whatever.
What are some of the best case scenarios for how you have that conversation? Do you schedule a sit-down meeting with the U's and the Danas of the world to relay it? What does that discussion of parting of ways look like?
Well, I think that you need to be fully prepared by talking with people like Dana, who are strategic healthcare consultants, and understand that those relationships with hospitals and doctors and your lawyer, so that you're fully prepared when you go in. You should expect that the knee-jerk reaction is going to be negative, but I think it needs to be you. I don't think you should have someone else have that discussion with the hospital. I think you need to sit down with the executives, explain that, everybody in the group, wants to terminate the PSA and go back to independent practice. A lot of times the hospital knows that the doctors have not been happy. It's, that they've been fighting over, whether they're counting the RVUs and their compensation correctly. And they probably have clashed on various things. That's what I generally see. It's not usually a surprise to anybody. I mean, it's still a surprise that they decided to take the bold step of giving a notice and going back into the community. But I think the conversation needs to be had by the doctors. And at the end of that in-person meeting, they would leave a copy of, the notice, the formal 90 or 60 day or, 6-month notice of termination, and leave it very positive about continuing in the community, continuing to be aligned with the hospital. We did this with a group 2 years ago in the Midwest, which was pretty much an entire specialty department of a hospital that decided to set up an arrangement with a private equity platform in the region. And they inked their agreement with the private equity platform that was going to build offices for them and have them ready to go after the 6-month notice period ended. And they went in and had the discussion. The hospital was upset. But in the end, it ended up with what we call a mini PSA, which is, the group, after separating from the hospital, continued to provide the on-call coverage, which was crucial to this hospital because they were pretty much 90% of this particular specialty. And they have directorships that are continuing and all that kind of stuff. And they've remained very closely aligned with the hospital. So that's a good example of how that can happen. And it's always bumpy at the beginning of that conversation.
It's fair. It's shocking, even if you know there's problems, to be told, I'm leaving you. So, Dana, from a politics and branding standpoint, knowing that your peer community is very important to a physician, what are some best practices for an individual surgeon or a small group of surgeons or even entire department who want to leave and go into a competitive group in the area?
Yeah, I'll use the lawyer and answer as well. Marnie, it depends. Politics are one thing. Sometimes when we end up with these types of situations where there is a break or a divorce, initially the hospital or health system comes out swinging or is very frustrated or, bows up. But at the end of the day, there's not enough doctors to replace the ones that we have. So everybody has to get along in healthcare at some level, right? I mean, there is patient care still at its core. If it's truly a, divorce where there's from one to the other, the doctors have to be aware of what that looks like. Is there a website underneath the hospital's umbrella? Some of our groups had independent groups and then joined a hospital, and they still have a very big brand in that geography. So that's where I said it depends. Also, very seldom does a patient walk into a large health system and say, "Oh, I can't wait to see Dr. HCA or Dr. UHS. They're here to see Dr. Jones or Dr. Johnson or Dr. Smith or Dr. whomever." So, a lot of times the patients will follow the physicians. The question is, based on the legal ramifications or based on the things that Gary outlined, what is the obligation of the health system to let the patient know where the hospital or where the doctor has gone? And there's very specific ways to have that put in the contracts of, hey, if the break is on October 1st, 2024, by October 15th, the patients need to be aware or not. I mean, there's ways to go both ways on that situation. So I think it really depends on how that break comes about. The political part, initially there's always some angst about that, but like I said, there's not enough physicians to go around for each region or each geography we have nationally. So at the end of the day, a lot of times patient care settles itself. We had a situation earlier this week where it was pretty tense between a physician group and an exiting physician in a hospital. And at the end of the day, the doctor said, "Look, we're going to take care of the patients. That's the right thing to do." And I think that still is the underlying piece of healthcare that all of us are still in it for. So, I think it's one of those things along with the legal structure. I mentioned this earlier, but, you really want to look at clinical, operational, financial. These should all be things that are outlined long before you're in the exit scenario. So you should have a plan in place for when you're going to let the patients know, when the website goes live, when the materials go live, intake forms, little things that become big things. You can't be using each other's information as you exit the process. But again, that should be laid out on a timeline. Let's say you have 16 months out or 12 months out. You should have a drop dead date, 60 days or 90 days out, where that stuff starts to be put into place so we can go lights on upon close.
It sounds almost like I equate it to a product launch. You're bringing a new product to market. It sounds very intensive.
It's a great analogy, Marnie. Yeah, it can be. I mean, if you have a plan, the intensity goes down, right? And just like a product launch or just like, any analogy you want to use, if you have a plan and you have strong advisors in your camp, you kind of know what the non-negotiables are, and you also know where the off-ramps are. So when they start to happen, yes, there's always things in the end zone that come up, but it's not a surprise. If you're talking to Gary, he might say, "Hey, just a heads up, I've had 5 other clients that went through this recently. These were some of the things that you might not anticipate. Let's anticipate them." If you're talking to me, I might say, "Hey, I've had, clients in the last 2 years that have gone through this. This is how they manage their branding. This is how they manage their patient communication." Trying to do this as an N of one in a case study that you don't understand, you don't know where the roads are, you don't know where the landmines are. It gets really complicated really quickly. But if you have a plan and you have good advisors that can show you where those speed bumps are, you know how to manage around them, or at least be prepared for them, right? So you've got an off-road or an off-ramp for any scenario that you face.
Beautiful. It's like having a really good ortho or neuro lead in the hospital and simultaneously a really good implant rep that partner together. They make sure things are moving forward. So hopefully you show up, you take care of the patient, and you go about to the next case.
100%, Marnie. It's just like following clinical guidelines, case studies. They always say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. You absolutely can see themes in this, but when you don't know the themes, you're showing up for a game you're unprepared for.
In that example that I gave you of that specialty group that had a PSA with a Midwest hospital, in the agreement that we struck with the private equity platform, we very specifically choreographed what was going to happen when. We sign our agreement with you. Within 5 days, we meet with the hospital and we explain the situation and we provide our notice of termination. We then schedule a meeting to introduce them to, either the private equity platform or the group you're going to join. And then everything really needs to be laid out up until the date of termination. And, all the what ifs, what if we're thrown out? Do we have a plan B? Do we have a temporary space we could go to if they just boot us out and breach? That would be the hospital breaching now, because we're supposed to stay for 6 months if the agreement requires a 6-month notice. So having a detailed battle plan that's carefully choreographed with extensive detail and is agreed upon by your future partner. And again, it's very hard to do this without a partner out there in the community, an existing group, another big company, private equity platform, whatever it is, to get you going with payer agreements in particular, and EMR and all the other expensive staffing and equipment that you need.
Well, thank you, Dana and Gary. These are extremely good tips in, quite frankly, what is a very delicate conversation on exiting employment or a PSA.
Thanks, Marnie. We really appreciate you having us and hosting us. This is a touchy subject, and it's nice to know that there's education out there for doctors if they're looking for solutions and aren't really sure where to ask or where to go.
I totally agree. Thank you very much.
If you'd like to request a complimentary town hall, either in person or via webinar with Dana and Gary to discuss employment or a PSA, please email info@vectormedicalgroup.com to schedule a time. For those who will attend this year's American Association of Hip and Knee Surgeons annual meeting, there's still time to register for the November 8th, 12:30 p.m. session at the upcoming 2024 annual AUKUS meeting. Remember to sign up specifically for the one titled Private Equity and Orthopedic Groups, latest updates, pros and cons, second bites, life after closing, and other strategic options. Check out the show notes for more information about this upcoming session.
Thanks for listening to Connect to Develop. You can find more interviews and Marnie's Minutes on my YouTube channel at Marney Reid Presents.